Madam President, over 2 months ago, the Senate Judiciary Committee unanimously voted to advance the Justice for Victims of Lynching Act of 2018, which I introduced proudly with Senators Booker and Senator Scott. This is an historic piece of legislation that would criminalize lynching, attempts to lynch, and conspiracy to lynch for the first time in America's history. Lynching is a part of the dark and despicable aspect of our country's history that followed slavery and many other outrages in our country. According to the Equal Justice Initiative, lynching was used as an instrument of terror and intimidation 4,084 times during the late 19th and 20th centuries. These lynchings were acts of violence. They were needless and horrendous acts of violence, and they were motivated by racism. And we must acknowledge that fact, lest we repeat it. Lynchings were also crimes that were committed against innocent people. These crimes should have been prosecuted. There were victims who should have received justice, but did not. With this bill, we are finally able to change that and correct a burden on our history as a country. We finally have a chance to speak the truth about our past and make clear that these hateful acts should never happen again without serious, severe, and swift consequence and accountability. From 1882 to 1986, the United States Congress failed to pass anti-lynching legislation when it had an opportunity 200 times. We now have an opportunity to pass this bill and to offer some long overdue justice and recognition to the victims of lynching and their families. Recognition that these were crimes, they are crimes, for which there should be severe consequence and accountability. I now yield my time to my friend, the great senator from the great state of New Jersey, Cory Booker.
Thank you very much.
Senator from New Jersey.
Thank you, Madam President. I want to really thank Senator Harris for her incredible partnership and leadership on this bill. I also want to thank Senator Tim Scott as well from South Carolina for his leadership on this legislation and for the consistent examples of character and integrity from these two individuals, my partners on this legislation, that they're showing in this body. As my colleague said, it's been a very long time coming. For over a century, members of Congress have attempted to pass some version of a bill that would recognize lynching for what it is, a bias-motivated act of terror. Today, Senator Harris and I are requesting that after a century, after 100 years, and over 200 different bills introduced in this body, that we finally make lynching a federal crime in the United States of America. And thanks to the work of incredible people around this country, truth tellers like Brian Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative, today we have a far more comprehensive understanding of just how widespread and purposefully lynching was used as a tool of racial terror and oppression in our history. We know that the Equal Justice Initiative was able to document thousands of cases, documented 4,000 cases of racially motivated lynching between 1877 and 1950, and that during that time, lynchings were used to terrorize communities. They weren't only vicious acts of murders against individuals, but in many cases, bodies hung, trying to drive fear into communities and make them submit to second-class citizenship and consistent injustice. The use of lynching as a larger part of terrorism is disturbing, and it's a dark past part of our history, but its legacy does not just live in our history books. Despite advocates and activists and organizations that have dedicated themselves to studying and addressing the racial terror in our history, we have failed to correct for many of those past sins. We know that the passage of this bill will not undo the damage, the terror, and the violence that's been done and the lives that were brutally taken in our past. But we do know that the passage of this bill even though it cannot reverse the irrevocable harm that lynching was used as a terror of suppression, the passage of this bill is a recognition of that dark past. We know that when wrongs are ignored, they fester underneath the skin of the body politics, and we know that justice delayed is justice denied. And so today, this is a moment of potential justice in this body. Justice for the victims of lynching that has too long been denied. I want to go back to a point of history in this body. The very first bill introduced in Congress to address the terror of lynching was introduced by a man on the other side of the Capitol named Congressman George Henry White. It was introduced in 1900, more than a century ago. And the year after it was introduced, that first bill, a year afterwards, 1901, was the last year he would serve in Congress. That's because Congressman White was the very last of the group of black congressmen who had been elected to Congress during Reconstruction. And with Congressman White's departure in 2001, it would be the last time that an African American would serve in the United States Congress, the last time a black Southerner would serve in the Congress for over 70 years. And Congressman White had a sense of understanding of what was going to come, the long dearth of lack of diversity. He knew that the terror of Jim Crow and voter disenfranchisement, that this was going to stop the election of African Americans. And so in his last speech on January 29th, 1901, in this body, a year after he introduced that bill to criminalize lynching, he delivered a farewell address, and he called that address, quote, "the Negro's temporary farewell to the American Congress." And in that farewell address over a century ago, here in Congress, he made the same request that Senator Harris and I are making now, the same request for the United States to officially criminalize lynching. I want to share just a part of what Congressman White said that day, close to 118 years ago to this very date. He said, and I quote, "Mr. Chairman, permit me to digress for a few minutes for the purpose of calling the attention of the House to the bill I regard as important, introduced by me in the early part of the first session of this Congress. It was intended to give the United States control and entire jurisdiction over all cases of lynching and death by mob violence. During the last session of this Congress, I took the occasion to address myself in detail to this particular measure, but with all my efforts, the bill still sweetly sleeps in the room of the committee to which it was referred. The necessity of legislation along this line is daily being demonstrated. The arena of the lyncher no longer is confined to southern climes, but is stretching its hydra head over all parts of the Union." Referring to the terror of lynching, Congressman White knew, and he said this final quote, he said, "The evil peculiar to America, yes, to the United States, must be met somehow, someday." Well, now in this moment in America, we have a chance to make someday today. We have the opportunity to recognize the wrongs of our history, to honor the memories of those brutally killed, and to leave a legacy that future generations can look back on, knowing that after 200 attempts and a century of trying, that on this day in American history, this body did the right thing. So I'd like to recognize my colleague from California for the historic call on this piece of legislation.
Thank you, Senator Booker. It is my true honor to be with you on the floor of the United States Senate, Madam President. Thank you. It is truly my honor, Senator Booker, to be on the floor of the United States Senate with you as a colleague and as a friend proposing this piece of legislation. And so, Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on the Judiciary be discharged from further consideration of S3178 and that the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration.
Clerk will report.
S3178, a bill to amend Title 18, United States Code to specify lynching as a deprivation of civil rights and for other purposes.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure?
Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
Without objection, that will proceed.
I further ask consent that the substitute amendment at the desk be agreed to and that the bill as amended be considered and read a third time.
Without objection.
I know of no further debate on the bill.
Is there further debate? If not, the question is on passage of the bill as amended. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Ayes appears to have it. The ayes do have it. The bill is amended as passed.
I ask unanimous consent the motion to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table.
Without objection.
And I want to thank our colleagues for this incredibly important act of bipartisanship in the United States Congress. Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President?
Senator from New Jersey.
You know, I think that there, as the senator from Oregon just came over, this is a very meaningful moment for this body. There's a speech by a man that I revere. His picture hangs in my office. His name is Martin Luther King. And for many people who endured the pain and the agony of our past, lynchings that went up to 1970 in this country, for those people who yearn for a justice that they would never experience, for those people who know the pain and the agony and the hurt in their family's history, the trauma that still is felt by many people today who remember lynching in this country that was so pervasive. King once spoke to those people that were hurting and wanting to see justice, and he asked at the end of his speech, he said, "How long? Not long, because the truth crushed to the earth will rise again." He asked, "How long? Not long, because no lie can live forever." He asked, "How long? Not long, because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." This has been a long arc, a painful history and shameful history in this body, that at the height of lynchings across this country affecting thousands of people, this body did not act to make that a federal crime. Well, this body, at least now, the United States Senate, has now acted. 100 senators, no objections. I just want to give gratitude to this body for what we have just done. I yield the floor. Thank you.